Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about classical prophecy in Judah with three prophets, Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. All three of these prophets prophesied during the 7th century. So this is going to be slightly later than what we've been talking about previously. But again, we're still in Judah in the southern kingdom. Let's set the historical context of what's going on during the 7th century in Judah. What we find is Assyrian domination of Judah and the ancient Near East from, say, 701 to 612 BCE. In 612, the capital of the Assyrian Empire was conquered. So for most of the 7th century, Assyria dominated the ancient Near East. They had a powerful military and a reputation for brutality and violence. We also find during this time the reign of Manasseh from 687 to 642 BCE. He was the king of Judah after Hezekiah. Manasseh has the longest reign of any king in Judah's history, which is somewhat ironic since the book of 2 Kings describes him as the most evil king in Judah's history. It should be noted that Manasseh comes right after Hezekiah. Hezekiah, remember, receives unqualified praise in the book of Kings. Only Hezekiah and Josiah receive unqualified praise, and yet Manasseh, who has a very long rule, the longest of any king, is described as the most evil. Manasseh is condemned for rebuilding the places where Canaanite gods were worshipped, which had been destroyed by Hezekiah. He promoted the worship of Canaanite and Assyrian gods in the temple, and he placed idols in the temples in Jerusalem. He was accused of child sacrifice and practicing witchcraft, as well as shedding a lot of innocent blood. He accommodated what the Assyrian Empire wanted. And this is likely the reason he is judged so severely by 2 Kings. We then move to the reign of Ammon. Ammon reigns for 2 years from 642 to 600 BCE. Ammon was assassinated, and this is something very rare in Judah. It's possible that anti-Assyrian groups in Judah rebelled against the king early in his reign and assassinated him. We then move to the reign of Josiah from 640 to 609 BCE. When Josiah takes the head of the kingship and becomes the king of Judah, he's only 8 years old. What we don't know is who actually may have been in charge in Jerusalem during Josiah's young boyhood. What we do know about Josiah is he receives unqualified praise. He institutes religious and national reforms from 627 to 621 BCE. Josiah actually seeks to unify the kingdom under the worship of Israel's God. Josiah does away with the places where Canaanite gods were worshipped. He cleanses the temple and he renovates it. And if you remember, during the renovation, the priest Hilkiah brought a book of the law discovered in the temple to Josiah. We believe that this was some form of Deuteronomy. And if you remember when we talked about Deuteronomy, and I've mentioned throughout the semester that Deuteronomy seems to follow Josiah's reforms. So Josiah, again, unqualified praise for his reign. In 612, we have the fall of Assyria. And then in 609, Josiah dies in battle with the king of Egypt. See, the king of Egypt wanted a piece of the collapsing Assyrian Empire. So Josiah met the Egyptian king at the Megiddo Pass. And here, unfortunately, Josiah is killed. In 605, so shortly after, 4 years after the death of Josiah, the kingdom of Babylon comes to prominence and replaces the Assyrian Empire. And if you remember, in 587, So some 20 years later, we're going to have the fall of the southern kingdom. So this sets the historical context of the 7th century in the southern kingdom, which is where Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk are giving their prophecy. First, let's talk about Zephaniah. Zephaniah is notoriously difficult to date. Specifically, it's difficult to date. There's evidence, though, that suggests that Zephaniah is prophesying at the end of the reign of Manasseh, during the time of cooperation with the Assyrian Empire, but before the reforms of King Josiah. If that's correct, then Zephaniah had a very positive influence on the kingdom of Judah for a very brief time. However, it may be that Zephaniah is not actually prophesying then, but this is something written in the 2nd century BCE and dated back to the reign of Manasseh. In any event, what we find is a notoriously difficult book to date. There are some themes and patterns from earlier prophets that we find in Zephaniah. We have the day of the Lord. This is found in Zephaniah 1. We see it as well in Amos 5. We see it in Isaiah 2 and in Isaiah 13. We also have oracles against the nations. These are the judgments against the nations outside of Israel. We find this in Zephaniah 2, in Amos 1 and 2, and again in Isaiah 13 through 22. What becomes particularly different in Zephaniah, and we talked briefly about this in Isaiah, is that the day of the Lord here in Zephaniah really begins to take on this end of days imagery. And we will talk about that in the course of talking about Zephaniah. There are some major themes in Zephaniah. The first major theme is cosmic chaos. This is found in Zephaniah 1 through 3. The word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, during the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. Now, notice that maybe this comes between Manasseh and Josiah. Then it continues, I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away both man and beast. I will sweep away the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea and the idols that cause the wicked to stumble. When I destroy all mankind on the face of the earth, declares the Lord. This cosmic chaos, then, is a judgment that extends to the whole world and seems to describe the undoing of creation in language borrowed from the description of creation in Genesis 1. Note in verse 3, He will sweep away, God will sweep away man and beast, birds in the sky, fish in the sea. Here we seem to see a reversal of creation. We then move into the next major theme, which is Judah's idolatry and corruption in Jerusalem. Judah's idolatry comes in 1:4 through 6. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will destroy every remnant of Baal worship in this place. The very names of the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry host, those who bow down and swear by the Lord, and who swear also by Molech, those who turn back from following the Lord and neither seek the Lord nor inquire of him. Judah's idolatry and the sweeping away of the priests comes down to a point where there is a specific mention of specific locations in Jerusalem. So in 1:10 and 11 it says, On that day, declares the Lord, a cry will go up from the fish gate, wailing from the new quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. Wail, you who live in the market district. All your merchants will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be destroyed. There is a linking between the judgment of the world and idolatry and corruption in Jerusalem. And that is the temple which was described as the center of the world. The temple functioned as a creation in miniature. That means it's designed to represent creation, with the outer courts of the nations and the inner court being the people of Israel. Inside the inner court was a large basin of water that represented the waters upon which creation was founded. This is inside the actual temple. And within the temple itself, there was a great hall and the Holy of Holies. Remember, the Holy of Holies is the dwelling place of God. In the temple, the priest followed God's instructions for maintaining the order of creation. Worship then was meant to support and restore the order of creation based upon God's design. This means that corruption and idolatry in Jerusalem and the temple threatens creation itself. So what we find here is that there's rampant corruption in Jerusalem, which is the place where the temple is, which is also therefore the place where God resides. Moreover, we find that Judah is worshiping the Baals. This is the theme we've talked about ever since Deuteronomy. What's going to happen when the people break the covenant? The bad cursings of Deuteronomy 28. What we then get after this description of cosmic chaos and a description of Judah's idolatry and the corruption that exists in Judah, we find the day of wrath. This comes from 1:7 to 2:3. So, picking up where we left off in verse 12. At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, who are like wine left on its dregs, who think the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad. Their wealth will be plundered, their houses demolished. Though they build houses, they will not live in them. Though they plant vineyards, they will not drink the wine. The great day of the Lord is near, near and coming quickly. The cry on the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty warrior shouts his battle cry. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. I will bring such distress on all people that they will grope about like those who are blind because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust and their entrails like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. In the fire of his jealousy, the whole earth will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. And then in chapter 2, first 3 verses, gather together, gather yourselves together, you shameful nation, before the decree takes effect and that day passes like windblown chaff. Before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you, seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. What we find here is an expansion of the day of the Lord. Remember in Amos, the day of the Lord seems to be referring to the Assyrian regime coming and destroying the northern kingdom. In Isaiah, the day of the Lord takes on a perhaps proto-apocalyptic move, in that it seems to suggest something about the end of days. But here we find the breaking in of God at the end of time itself, in which God will once again destroy all mankind. But this day of the Lord is not without another major theme, which is a remnant of Judah. We find the remnant there in verse 3. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. Perhaps there's going to be a remnant. What follows this is a list of oracles against the nations. In 4 through 7, we have an oracle against Philistia. In 8 through 11, we have oracles against Moab and Ammon. In verse 12 alone, we have an oracle against Cush. In verse 13 through 15, ending chapter 2, we have an oracle against Assyria. And then we move to an oracle against Jerusalem, starting in chapter 3. Woe to the city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled. She obeys no one. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials within her are roaring lions. Her rulers are evening wolves who leave nothing for the morning. Her prophets are unprincipled. They are treacherous people. Her priests profane the sanctuary and do violence to the law. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no wrong. Morning by morning he dispenses his justice, and every new day he does not fail, yet the unrighteous know no shame. And then we find that Jerusalem will remain unrepentant in verses 6 through 8. And then we get back to this idea of the remnant in 11 through 13. So starting in 9, then I will purify the lips of the peoples. Then all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, my scattered people will bring me offerings. And in 11, on that day you, Jerusalem, will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me, because I will remove from you your arrogant boasters. Never again will you be haughty on my holy hill, but I will leave within you the meek and the humble. The remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord. They do no wrong. They tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. The remnant in Zephaniah takes on the characteristic of humility. They are the humble of the land. They are a people humble and lowly. The idea of a remnant exists throughout many of the prophets. The people of God, the people of Israel, the Israelites, will not be completely destroyed. A remnant will remain. And then at the end of Zephaniah, we get what I term a glorious restoration. So our last few verses: sing, daughter Zion, shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment, has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves you. He takes great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. This restoration occurs after the judgment coming to Judah. In the restoration, God will appear in Jerusalem as a king. He will return victoriously to the city, and there will be a great celebration, and the Lord himself will lead the singing. So the question then comes down to, what do we do with Zephaniah? Is Zephaniah simply talking about what may be coming with the Babylonian Empire, or is Zephaniah somehow apocalyptic? While we're not going to discuss apocalypticism in its full context in this class, just due to time constraints and the simple fact that apocalypticism and apocalyptic literature are notoriously difficult for scholars to pen down, what I will say is the day of the Lord in Zephaniah seems more likely to be apocalyptic than to be some sort of post-exilic prophecy. And by post-exilic, I mean, is this written after the exile, during the Second Temple period? And does it then just reflect the idea that a remnant will remain after Jerusalem is completely destroyed in 587? Or is this actually the beginning of a belief within the Israelite people that the end of days will occur, and that at the end of days, God will come and judge everyone? Because it seems that everyone in this, quote, known world, the known nations, are judged, and are judged by the sword in the oracles against the nations. Moreover, it seems that both Israel and Judah are judged, and yet at the end, God will dwell among them. This seems to be a theophany. The idea that God in some sort of bodily form will appear before the people, which to me suggests that this is possibly more apocalyptic than just some sort of post-exilic prophecy. Nevertheless, it is quite up for debate about whether Zephaniah is apocalyptic or not. However, main themes: cosmic chaos, God's undoing of creation, Judah's continued idolatry and the corruption in the Jerusalem temple. Then you have the day of wrath. You have this expansion of what the day of the Lord means. You have the recurring theme of a remnant of the people returning and being then restored to their place as God's people. Moving on to Nahum, the feet of one who brings good tidings. Major themes within Nahum are God as the heavenly warrior. This occurs in the first 10 verses of the chapter. A prophecy concerning Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and vents his wrath against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is the whirlwind and the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, the world and all who live in it. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his fierce anger? His wrath is poured out like fire. The rocks are shattered before him. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust him. But with an overwhelming flood, he will make an end of Nineveh. He will pursue his foes into the realm of darkness. Whatever they plot against the Lord, he will bring to an end. Trouble will not come a second time. They will be entangled among thorns, and drunk from their wine, they will be consumed like dry stubble. God, as the heavenly warrior, has the major qualities of vengeance and justice. Nahum the prophet emphasizes within this theme that the justice of God is one who punishes evil. Here we find a poem of theophany. Here we have the description of the appearing of God having an effect on the created world with the purpose of judgment. So our first major theme is God, the heavenly warrior. The second major theme is judgment for Assyria is good news for Judah. Occurs in 1:11 through 15. From you, Nineveh, has come one forth who plots evil against the Lord and devises wicked plans. This is what the Lord says. Although they have allies and are numerous, they will be destroyed and pass away. Although I have afflicted you, Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the images and idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile. Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. The bad news for Assyria and the destruction of Nineveh is good news for Judah. This judgment for Assyria uses the image of a messenger coming over the mountains with news that Assyria has fallen. The evil empire is coming to an end. Chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 19, the remainder of the book, portrays the destruction of Nineveh. What we find are parallel poems that describe the destruction of Nineveh. So, we also find here that the poetry is elevated in style and the subject is graphic and dark. Nahum is one of the most gifted poets in the Old Testament, and the subject of his poetry in the last 2 chapters is the violent destruction of the city of Nineveh and the death of the people who live there. What you sense in the book of Nahum is the pain and resentment of people who have suffered at the hands of a brutal tyrant for over 100 years. The emotional release is that finally justice is being done. So here's how Nahum constructs the destruction of Nineveh, beginning in chapter 2. An attacker advances against you, Nineveh. Guard the fortress, watch the road, brace yourselves, marshal all your strength. The Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob like the splendor of Israel, though destroyers have laid them waste and have ruined their vines. The shields of the soldiers are red, the warriors are clad in scarlet. The metal on the chariots flashes on the day they are made ready. The spears of juniper are brandished. The chariots storm through the streets, rushing back and forth through the squares. They look like flaming torches. They dart about like lightning. Nineveh summons her picked troops, yet they stumble on their way. They dash to the city wall. The protective shield is put in place. The river gates are thrown open and the palace collapses. It is decreed that Nineveh be exiled and carried away. Her female slaves moan like doves and beat on their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool whose water is draining away. Stop, stop, they cry, but no one turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. The supply is endless, the wealth from all its treasures. She is pillaged, plundered, stripped. Hearts melt, knees give way, bodies tremble. Every face grows pale. Where now is the lion's den, the place where they fed their young, where the lion and lioness went, and the cubs with nothing to fear? The lion killed enough for his cubs and strangled the prey for his mate, filling his lairs with the kill and his dens with the prey. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard. And in chapter 3, woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The crack of whips and the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords and glittering spears. Many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number. People stumble over the corpses, all because of the wanton lust of a prostitute, alluring the mistress of sorceries who enslaved the nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. I will pelt you with filth. I will treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. All who see you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is in ruins. Who will mourn her? Where can I find anyone to comfort you? Are you better than Thebes, situated on the Nile with water around her? The river was her defense, the waters her wall. Cush and Egypt were her boundless strength, put in Libya among her allies. Yet she was taken captive and went into exile. Her infants were dashed to pieces at every street corner. Lots were cast for her nobles, and all her great men were put in chains. You too will become drunk. You will go into hiding and seek refuge from the enemy. All your fortresses are like fig trees with their first ripe fruit. When they are shaken, the figs fall into the mouth of the eater. Look at your troops. They are all weaklings. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies, and fire has consumed the bars of your gates. Draw water from the siege. Strengthen your defenses. Work the clay. Tread the mortar. Repair the brickwork. There the fire will consume you, the sword will cut you down, they will devour you like a swarm of locusts. Multiply like grasshoppers, multiply like locusts. You have increased the number of your merchants till they are more numerous than the stars in the sky, but like locusts, they strip the land and then fly away. Your guards are like locusts, your officials like locusts. They settle in the walls on a cold day, but when the sun appears, they fly away and no one knows where. King of Assyria, your shepherds slumber. Your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountain with no one to gather them. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall. For who has not felt your endless cruelty? What we find are two poems that describe the violent destruction of Assyria and Nineveh. So within this, we have some questions that rise up from this text. The first is the justice of God. What is the justice of God? And for the people of Judah who have lived under the reign of a tyrant for over 100 years, do they think that justice is coming? Nahum seems to suggest that justice may be delayed, but that justice does come. A terrible and violent empire like Assyria does receive its just punishment. What we find is Nahum answering the question, does God bring justice? And Nahum resoundingly answers yes. We then have a theme of the acts that vaunted itself over the user. This comes from Isaiah 10. Woe, from Isaiah 10:5. Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I will send against him against a godless nation. I will dispatch him against the people who anger me, to seize loot and snatch plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. But this is not what he intends. This is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy, to put an end to many nations. Are not my commanders all kings, he says? Has not Kalno fared like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad, and Samaria like Damascus? As my hand sees the kingdom of the idols, kingdoms whose images excelled those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images, as I dealt with Samaria and her idols? What we find is, then continuing in verse 15, does the axe raise itself above the person who swings it, or the saw boast against the one who uses it? What we find is Nahum providing the answer from Isaiah. Is Assyria going to be destroyed? Yes. Isaiah announces that Assyria will likely be destroyed by God in an oracle against Assyria. And what we find then in Nahum is the realization of this judgment, that Assyria is going to fall. The final problem we have in Nahum is a problem of the language of sexual violence. The city of Nineveh in Nahum is personified as a woman. In poetry, cities are personified as females, and many cities in the ancient Near East had patron goddesses. In chapter 3 of Nahum, the punishment of Nineveh is described as God stripping the city of Nineveh naked and exposing the city to its enemies, which is an act of sexual violence. God described as punishing a city in the way a gang would attack and humiliate a woman. What we have to realize within this poem in chapter 3 is that it is poetry. It is not God literally attacking with sexual violence. Nineveh is a city, not a person. It's figurative language that's used in Nahum. It's not meant to be taken literally. But nevertheless, this problem of the language of sexual violence, this language creates a problem for us as readers. It is something ethically that we have to deal with. It is hard to describe the fall of your enemies in language that could not be used against yourself in a different context. Here in Nahum, what we find is the destruction of Assyria. And interestingly, we do not find anything against Judah. There is no oracle against Judah. There is no oracle against Israel. There is only here the destruction of Assyria. That is something that is unique to Nahum. Moving to our last prophet for today, we'll look at Habakkuk, the prophet upon the watchtower. Here again, as with Zephaniah, we have the issue of dating. Scholars date this somewhere between 605 BCE and the 3rd century BCE, with the majority saying that it fits the fall of Assyria in 612 BCE and the rise of Babylon in 605. So what we find is the historical roller coaster of 612 to 605 BCE. In 612, as I mentioned earlier, we have the fall of Assyria. And then in 609, we have the death of Josiah. And then in 605, we have the rise of Babylon. So from 609 to from 612 to 605, we have a brief period of independence and renewed nationalism in Judah, before they again become captive to a Mesopotamian empire. The problem with dating Habakkuk is that our superscript, that is our first verse in our Bible, only reads the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. It gives us no sense of dating when this happens. Habakkuk opens with a dialogue between the prophet and God. So we find that the prophet speaks for the people. Starts, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted." We have Habakkuk beginning his prophecy with a cry of lament for the people. The focus of the cry is on ongoing violence and injustice. The first 3 statements of the lament are questions. A lament in the form of a question is generally called a complaint. So Habakkuk's complaint to God is an unanswered prayer, ongoing violence, and injustice. There's been a perversion of justice, and the law itself has collapsed. it is completely unclear what specific situation Habakkuk is referring to. Some people suggest it's the late Assyrian Empire, so they're 612 BCE-ish. Others suggest it's just injustice within Judah itself, and so somehow is paralleled to Zephaniah, who's talking about the injustice within Jerusalem. And others say that anyone could complain about what Habakkuk complained about at any time. Again, this makes it unbelievably difficult and perhaps even possibly impossible to date Habakkuk with certainty. And then God answers Habakkuk. So Habakkuk has given his lament, he's given his complaint, he's questioned God, and God answers in verse 5 through 11. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Chaldeans, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They come all intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all the fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose strength is their God. God's response is the Chaldeans. The one word, the Chaldeans, is the only clue to dating the book. The only clue. The Chaldeans likely refers to the Babylonians, and so in some translations it will just say, I am raising up the Babylonians. In 605, the Babylonian Empire rises to prominence in the ancient Near East and replaces the Assyrian Empire and defeats the Egyptian army. What remains unclear in God's answer is how exactly this answers Habakkuk's question. Habakkuk's question of how long must we call for help and you not listen, or look at injustice, or tolerate wrongdoing. But what's happening is that the nation of Babylon is arising to do the work of God. God chooses the Babylonian Empire to bring out and mete out the justice for God. So then we have Habakkuk making another complaint. In verse 12, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them with his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet. And so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest foods. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watchtower and station myself on my ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. We have Habakkuk's response to God. Why are you silent when the wicked swallow those who are more righteous than they? Habakkuk is just simply asking if this is right. The silence of God at the suffering of the innocent is a question that has actually never been answered. Habakkuk says he will stand there in 2:1 because what is happening does not seem to be just. This is the question of theodicy. Is God just in what he does or does not do? Is God right to raise up the Babylonians, or is God right to be silent when the righteous are destroyed? And then we find God's answer in 2 through 5. So we have a complaint and an answer, a complaint and an answer. Then the Lord replied, "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that my herald may run with it. For the revelation waits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it will linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is greedy as the grave and like death is never satisfied. And he gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the people." The answer is about a vision that is to be written down on tablets so a runner may read it. This may be sort of like a billboard. In the ancient Near East, messengers ran to deliver their messages, and they would have written notes. So here it needs to be written down like the notes of a messenger. And then we have this curious statement of a vision for the appointed time of the end. The question is, the end of what? The end of the world? The end of the complaint? It's likely here that the case that this is the end of what Habakkuk is complaining about. God says, "Wait, because you don't understand yet what I'm doing." And then in verse 4 of God's response, it says, "Look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous live by their faithfulness." Righteous is singular, not plural. The righteous person will live by his faithfulness. This is a call for Habakkuk to decide. Will you be like the proud, thinking you know better than God? Or will you live out a life of faithfulness in what God is doing? It seems to be a bit of a mild rebuke of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is essentially about a crisis of faith, caused by a clear injustice leading to a decision of faith in what God is doing. Habakkuk is having a crisis of faith. In 2:6 through 20, and then again in chapter 3, what we find are oracles and a hymn of Habakkuk. We find 5 woes in Habakkuk against an evil empire in 2:6 through 20. "Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you have plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will plunder you, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high, to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Woe to him who gives drinks to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to the wood, "Come to life," or the lifeless stone, "Wake up." Can it give guidance? It is covered in gold and silver, and there is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. We have some general and some veiled references here to the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians themselves will not escape judgment, but the timing of this judgment is up to God. Before we talk about what's going on in the hymn of theophany in chapter 3, it's important to note that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find a pesher, a teaching on Habakkuk. Essentially, a pesher takes a few verses and then expounds on them to say what they mean. Interestingly, in the Habakkuk pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, chapter 3 is missing. What this possibly tells us are two things. One, the Habakkuk pesher was never completed, because the end of the last scroll of the Habakkuk pesher has room left on it. So perhaps it was never completed. Or perhaps chapter 3 is added at a much later time. What we cannot say with certainty is whether or not Habakkuk 3 is original to Habakkuk or if it was added at a later date. If we base it simply on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Habakkuk pesher, it is likely that Habakkuk 3 is added at a later date. What we find, though, in chapter 3 is a hymn of theophany. And it begins interestingly in that it has its own heading. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigayonot. Shigayonot, we don't know what that means. That's a Hebrew term that maybe likely refers to some sort of musical accompaniment. But it's interesting that it begins with its own heading. This also suggests that it's possibly added at a later date, which means then the final version of Habakkuk we have now would not have necessarily been the version of Habakkuk that was circling around in, say, the 3rd to 1st century BCE. However, what we find is a hymn of theophany. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day, in our time make them known. In wrath remember mercy. God came from Timon, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him, pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed, but he marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers, and the mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. It goes on and on and on. What we have here is a description of theophany, the revelation of God's presence in the created world, along with the reactions of the creatures in the created realm. It includes a petition, it begins with praise, and it has a reference to justice and mercy. It's a description of God's appearance in the response of the natural world, God coming to earth to judge the wicked and save the righteous. It fits the expectation of the vision in chapter 2. God coming in great power to judge the wicked and save the faithful. It's a vision of the end. What this suggests there are some benefits to lament and complaint. As I said before, Habakkuk is having a crisis of faith. Habakkuk voices complaints, receives response, and in the end, his crisis of faith is averted because his faith is stronger at the end of the book. God's responses are mysterious. The change comes from experiencing God's presence. It's rather the presence of God with Habakkuk in the response rather than the response itself that creates the change. And just like in the previous two prophets, we are left with some questions. We have the question of theodicy. Is God just? We have a question of the centrality of faith. There is no rational response to theodicy. The only certainty is to remain faithful. Habakkuk finds that in his crisis of faith, he's able to remain faithful. And then we find that spiritual experiences overcome moral objections. In other words, Habakkuk has moral objections to the injustice and the violence, and apparently God's not hearing the people. And yet, what we see in the end is that Habakkuk has had some sort of spiritual experience which leads him to believe that God will mete out justice in his own time. So, in summary, Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk continue the prophecy in Judah in the 7th century. Each book has both good news and bad news. There is bad news in Zephaniah that Jerusalem and the southern kingdom will be, and essentially the entire world will be utterly destroyed. But there's good news because at least a remnant will remain. In Nahum, Assyria will be destroyed. That's the bad news. But the good news is Judah will be lifted up. Judah will remain. And in Habakkuk, the bad news is the Babylonians are coming. The good news is the Babylonians will eventually be judged and a remnant will remain. And then perhaps also just as important as the good news, bad news is the question of dating each of the books of Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk is rather speculative. All three books are notoriously difficult to date.